So our first speaker is Dr. Charles Morrison. Dr. Morrison is the immediate past president of the East-West Center. And I thought I'd spend just a few seconds on explaining the East-West Center. East-West Center was established by the US Congress in 1960. And its express purpose was to promote better understanding and relationship between the United States and Asia. And so clearly, I couldn't think of a better speaker to start us out with, but someone who's been the president of the East-West Center from 1998 to December 2016. So he's really led that center and been a moving spirit behind this better relationship between the United States and Asia. He's been a very strong proponent of improved relations between the United States and Asia. He's a particular expert in this field. He has been the international chair and co-chair of the Standing Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. He holds numerous positions, and it would take me all day to just enumerate all the positions that he holds and advice that he gives. He also started out with a PhD in international affairs from Johns Hopkins. He has had numerous publications in Japan, China, and the ASEAN countries, and also the Asia-Pacific Security Outlook. He's a true blue intellectual in the field of the United States and its relationship with Asia. And so his topic today is US-India relations, the Asian context. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Morrison. And I'm also going to invite Dr. Krishnamurthy to come and give Dr. Morrison a plaque and a memento to honor.
Well, thank you all very much, and I'm very honored to be able to join this very distinguished group to inaugurate the first U.S.-India Friendship Summit. I want to thank Dr. Singh, Dr. Jiang, the co-conveners, Creighton University, its Asian World Center, the India Association of Nebraska, all the sponsors, the volunteers, the speakers, the participants, all today. It's wonderful for all of you to come together to inaugurate this very important event. I think Omaha is a very beautiful city, and its central location in the United States makes it a very fitting and appropriate place to hold this meeting. You know, I feel very inadequate after listening to the congressman. And I was thinking as I was listening to him, I learned a couple of things. And one thing that I learned is that Krishnamurthy has a different meaning than I thought. You know, I learned that Krishnamurthy means future president of the United States. You know, and there's nothing that he said that dissuaded me from that. And the second thing I was thinking was that, you know, they say that members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, agree on only one thing. That's the importance of India. And so it really is. I think the India caucus is the largest country caucus in the Congress, as far as I know. My own area has really been the international relations of East and Southeast Asia, not so much South Asia. But in a general sense, I have followed India since I was an undergraduate student, which was about 5 decades ago. I spent a summer working on the India desk at the Department of State as a clerk typist. Can you imagine we had typewriters at one time in our history? And over the years, and particularly in this millennium, the most impressive thing about US-India relations has been their steady widening, deepening, and strengthening. irrespective of the governments and the leaders in either country. While leaders and leadership are important, I think this means that there are deeper, more fundamental drivers of the relationship. And these drivers mean that each prime minister, each president, regardless of party, understands that there are positive benefits to continuing to enhance the relationship. So what are the drivers? I will list 5 of them, I think. And the first, which I remember from my brief State Department days, and which are highlighted in the mission of the summit and highlighted by the speakers so far, can be characterized as common values and aspirations. It has been a staple of Indian and American political speeches from the late 1940s onward that we are the 2 most populous democracies in the world. I doubt that either Indians or Americans would characterize our democracies as perfect, but the basic concept of government of, by, and for the people prevail in both. Both countries have experienced peaceful political change in accordance with their constitutional processes. And so ultimately, people decide on the selection of their leaders, and they can change them. There is accountability to people in both countries. And our democracies are based on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, again, guaranteed in our constitutions. And while, again, the practice may not be perfect, the fact is that in both countries there can be vigorous criticism of public officials and debate on policy issues. Our societies also respect freedom of faith. One of the greatest tragedies of South Asia is that the subcontinent was divided at independence into 2 states. One, Pakistan, with a religious foundation, and the other, India, with a secular one. The fundamental values that India and the United States share have been an enduring driver of our relationship. But there are other important drivers. And one of these, obviously, is the Indian-American community. At the time of my stint in the Department of State, half-century ago, there were less than 50,000 Indian Americans. Today, there are about 4 million, many of them living in Illinois. My home state of Hawaii, where incidentally President Obama was born, counts for a little more than 2,000. And even Nebraska has just 7 or so thousand. But metropolitan New York has 800,000 Indian Americans. Metropolitan Chicago, 250,000. And Washington, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and of course Silicon Valley, over 100,000 each. And Indian Americans are making enormous contributions to our governance, as the Congressman has just demonstrated, to our business and economy, to innovation, to community life at all levels. They're also a strong connector between the people of the United States and the 1.3 billion people of India. In my view, the US openness to legal immigration and the ability to attract talent from all over the world is one of the biggest single reasons the United States will remain a leading and dynamic society for decades to come. With 350 million Americans, we have only a quarter of the population of China. But 50 million of those Americans, almost 50 million, were born somewhere else. And China, with 1.4 billion people, has less than 1 million people that were born somewhere else. And this is a huge difference in the nature of these 2 societies. And our openness gives enormous advantages to the United States: access to new talents, to languages, to cultures, to connections throughout the world. Assets that many other countries do not enjoy. The third driver of the relationship has been the growth of economic interdependence. This is a more recent product, which happened in large part because of India's economic growth and the policy changes beginning in the late 1980s, although there is still much more needed to fully open India. We will be discussing economics this afternoon, so I don't want to say much now, but let me just note that India's two-way trade in goods and services with the United States and U.S. investment in India have both doubled since 2005. Of any state, California exports most to India, some 7.5 billion annually, followed by New York. Nebraska's exports to India are estimated at about 80 million. The fourth driver is the growing people-to-people relationships, which, of course, are related to the growing size of the India-American community and to the economic relationship. One important dimension of this are the Indian students in the United States. Over 150,000 Indians a year come to the United States, many to Creighton, compared to only 4,000 US students coming to India. Purchases by Indian students and their parents in the United States of educational services, housing, food, dating, supplies, and so forth, all of that amounts to maybe 5 billion annually. Tourism and visitor numbers are growing. More than 1 million visits from each country to the other country annually. The United States is the largest source of tourism to India, and that's a remarkable figure because American tourists generally are a small part of tourism to Asian countries. But there's much more room for growth in people-to-people relations, as I will come back to later. And a final driver, and what should be my main topic, is the geostrategic driver of the relationship. And this is an area where there's also been a tremendous change in recent years. Through much of the Cold War period, US-India strategic relationships were not particularly close. India was suspicious of US relations with Pakistan, which was a formal ally of the United States through the Manila Pact. And the United States was suspicious of India's ties to the US main Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union. Today, by contrast, there has been a lot of convergence in the two countries' strategic outlooks and growing defense cooperation, including the US designation of India as a major defense partner, military sales, defense co-production and development, joint training and exercises, cooperation in the field of counter-terrorism, and several strategic and security-related dialogues. So let me just tick off some of the factors that I think have accounted for this. And first was the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War period, the United States and the Soviet Union had been leaders of what were perceived as blocs, while India sought to establish itself as one of the leaders of the non-aligned bloc. This tripart conception of the world began to fade with the Sino-Soviet split, and a shift from a world of alliances to a world of more fluid alignments. But the collapse of communism in Russia around 1990 created an international order much less based on ideological identities. And this gave much more space, both internationally and domestically, for the United States and India to move together. Secondly, the rise of China, first as an economic power and more recently as a military power, accompanied by high-handed Chinese behavior toward its neighbors in East Asia, has provoked concern in both the United States and India. As Henry Kissinger has pointed out, India applies a kind of informal Monroe Doctrine to a sphere of interest covering the Indian Ocean from the Horn of Africa to Singapore. Within this space, it does not want to see the rise of any hegemonial power. It is concerned about China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean, from its so-called string of pearls naval strategy to its support for Pakistan through the China-Pakistan economic corridor. While outside of this immediate sphere, China claims 90% of the South China Sea in violation of accepted understanding of the law of the sea. And it has built artificial islands to buttress these claims, and it has used coercive means to intimidate other claimants. Relatedly, and thirdly, there has been a rise, or I think kind of a re-rise, of the concept of an Indo-Pacific region, emphasizing the Indian and Pacific Oceans as interconnected strategic space. This concept situates India in the American strategic conception, not simply as a country within a region unto itself, but as an essential element of a broader Asia-Pacific region in which the United States has long-standing strategic interests. the Malabar exercises, which involve India, the United States, and Japan as permanent partners, the three permanent partners, and the US, Japan, India trilateral ministerial dialogues, most recent just held last month, are examples of these Indo-Pacific connections. Fourth, the dehyphenation of India with Pakistan in the US thinking. This may not be fully complete, but I think largely so. I think this has had enormous positive implications for India, which resented being typed as simply a part of a security problem with a difficult neighbor. Fifth, the continued turmoil in the Middle East and Central Asia and the terrorist threats emanating from these regions. India stands out as a stable, predictable bulwark just to the east of this volatile and difficult region, which keeps sucking the United States into its internal turmoil. Both India and the United States have suffered at the hands of terrorist threats emanating from that area, and both understand the value of our cooperation in the Middle East and Central Asia. Sixth, I believe, is a general acceptance in the United States of India as a legitimate and responsible nuclear weapons state. We want as few nuclear weapons countries as possible, and thus the Non-Proliferation Treaty formally recognizes only the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council as full nuclear weapon states. But because of India's size, its strategic situation, and because Congressman Krishnamurti is going to ensure that India becomes a permanent member of the United Nations, it has been progressively accepted as a legitimate nuclear power, at least by the United States. And finally, one might point out the rise of several non-traditional strategic issues, including climate change, water shortages, human rights. These issues have provided additional venues for India and the United States to work together, and I believe they will continue to do so. There are probably other dimensions that should be mentioned, and maybe these will come up later, but I think the core of the geostrategic relationship is our common interest in a peaceful, rules-based international system. While norms and rules are not always well-defined, clear violations, such as the North Korean nuclear weapons program, terrorist attacks, maritime space overreaches, cause India and the United States to appreciate their common concerns and work more closely together. Now, what about the future? Because I believe that progress in US-Indian relations has been based on a convergence of interests and not simply on personalities. I am bullish about the future. But I think it's important to contain expectations, to appreciate that the future will not be without issues, and to understand that there do need to be agents such as the India Association of Nebraska, such as friendship summits, to foster and deepen these relationships. These agents are important at our national level and also at local levels. We do not yet have a sufficiently strong fabric of relations, as fragmentary surveys of attitudes in the two countries suggest. In particular, I believe that while Americans have a growing appreciation of India, there's not yet a sufficient understanding of the weight and importance of India. In the most recent survey of the Chicago Global Council, for example, suggests that American public only has a middling appreciation of India's importance. And this is the reason that my colleagues at the East-West Center, together with the Federation of the India Chamber of Commerce and Industry, have developed a booklet and website of facts and figures to highlight that India matters to America, America matters to India. And you can find the information they have collected, broken down where possible by state, states in the United States and states in India, on our East-West Center website. As the relationship has become more comprehensive, there are also more issues on which there can be disagreements. Fortunately, these issues are typically not about goals. They are not really strategic, but they are about the terms of the partnership. Both countries, for example, have become more concerned about economic policies after 2008. The US worries about intellectual property protection, local regulations, tax disputes. India worries about US visa policies, market accesses, and potential protectionism. The current US administration tends to equate bilateral surpluses with unfairness, and it is reviewing India's surplus, which is not one of the largest, but one that for structural reasons alone is likely to grow. India and the United States are at different stages of their economic development, and it is natural that their economic interests and priorities will differ. In the geostrategic space, we must recognize that while our interests have converged, they are not identical. We can think of a whole range of issues, from connectivity issues to Kashmir, from Pakistan to Rohingyas, on which there may be somewhat different approaches, on which one country places more emphasis or emphasis in a different way than the other. To help us identify these differences and to clearly understand where each side is coming from, we will need more structured dialogues between Americans and Indians, not just US-India issues, but on regional and global issues. These are increasingly happening, where we discuss China, or Afghanistan, or terrorism, or human rights, or climate change. But my impression is that we do not yet have the intensity of dialogue in the US-India relationship that we have for US-China or US-Japan relations. I believe that people-to-people dialogues need expansion. The single Japanese prefecture of Hokkaido has almost as many sister city relationships as the whole country of India with the United States. More than 400 Japanese and American cities have sister relationships, compared to 25 or 26 for India and US cities. The Philippines has double the number of India. Finally, let me circle back to one of the drivers of our relations, of democracy, freedom of expression, and rule of law. Democracy is oddly both the greatest asset in a relationship as well as a cause of some friction. When I say asset, I mean that I believe that it is inevitable that India, like China before it, will continue to rise. But in my view, because India is a democratic country sharing so many values with the United States, India's rise will never be viewed by Americans as a fundamental threat to the global order in a way that we sometimes fear China's rise. But when I say that our common adherence to democracy may be a cause of friction, I mean that there is a certain political noise over policy issues in democratic countries with free presses. Foreign policies can be vigorously debated and easily politicized. Incidents that are not fundamental to our relations receive disproportionate attention at times, and we sometimes misread each other's politics, mistaking marginal comments or episodes for important ones. It should be no surprise that we misunderstand each other because we often don't understand our own politics. That said, I want to close by reiterating a comment made by India's highly capable Foreign Secretary Jaishankar when he was ambassador to the United States, a good friend. He said he tells Indian audiences that to achieve India's key priorities, energizing its economy, raising technological and management capabilities, securing its homeland, and ensuring a stable international power environment, the United States is an indispensable part for me to conceive of a partnership as natural, as comfortable, as strategically important as that between India and the United States. Thank you very much.